This is Duke University.
When we think of Fred Jameson, you all know all about him, so it's not like I'll tell you who he is. But I'll say a few things. When we think about Fred Jameson and the subject of today, one thing we have learned from you, Fred, is to think of world literature not as involving bodies of literature and individual readers who partake in it, but to think of it instead as a matter of relationships and networks, and all the people who participate in these networks do some from a situation. Let me just say from what situation I come to this event. I am situated two ways that are to me highly relevant as I think about today. First of all, I am the president of Duke University. I am situated in the role of president of Duke University. From that position, I'm able to say what extraordinary pride this university takes in you being awarded the great honor that is about to be bestowed on you in Norway. We didn't need you, hello Miriam, we didn't need you to win this prize, and actually our esteem for you is in no way raised by this prize, it seems to me. We are simply happy that the rest of the world has learned a little something about the continual pride we feel in having you as a colleague, in having your intelligence, your breadth of knowledge, your breadth of curiosity, and your breadth of personal generosity. All those have meant to the life of Duke University in its modern period. And so for us, the honor is an honor partly to that. But let me say something else. It is a curiosity that I may be the only person in this room interested in this curiosity. I am one of two people who are presidents of sizable American universities whose personal training is in literary studies. Other universities have simply missed the boat on this phenomenon, it seems to me. But that being so, I can speak personally as someone who entered the field of literary study. My PhD is from 1972. And so let me just use myself as a sample reader in this field and say what it has meant that you have done your work. I read my first work by Fred Jameson in about 1971. When I heard that this event was taking place, I went upstairs and got out all the books of yours that I have read from beginning to end. It included works that go back to Marxism and Form. It goes back to Prison House of Language. It comes forward to Political Unconscious. Certainly it would include postmodernism and the cultural logic of capitalism. And there they were, all my earnest underlinings and all my marginalia, page after page after page. But to look back through these books was just to be remembered of something that I think we all know, which is how much of the body of European intelligence entered American literary thought through the vehicle of your mind. All kinds of authors and theorists I thought I knew about, I remembered I first knew about them by reading you on the subject. That's meaningful because there's a sense in which the social and political turn of literary study in the last 20 or 30 years is to be thanked in a particular way to you, and you're one of the people who most assured that way of studying literary production would have the kind of deep and powerful intellectual consciousness in it that you have brought it. A third thing I associate with you is that when I came into the field of study, the political or social study of literature was thought to be at odds with the formal or literary study of literature. But of course, to go back early in your work is to see how vehemently you disputed that distinction and how much you always made matters of style or matters of form be themselves the material for social analysis. And then the other thing I feel looking back, and I'm almost done when I say this, is to go back to the time when you spoke of late capitalism. You know, late capitalism wasn't even that late when you spoke about it. Or let us put it this way, late capitalism was by no means as late as it would later be when you first wrote about it. And even to go back to your work on postmodernism, the concept of postmodernism took the world by storm, but it was associated with a very quickly cliched, very quickly conventionalized style of architecture, style of narrative. I associate you with helping the world understand that a far deeper and wider phenomenon was at stake than that, that needed to be understood in terms of other developments of modern culture, not least its political and economic dimensions. You are a person who's done what everyone in this room aspires to. You started out curious about things, and you had, I'll steal a phrase from Henry James, you had the courage of your curiosity. The things that interested you, you have found a way to have those unfold and unfold and unfold over the course of what now becomes quite a long, productive career. So we are happy to be here to honor you. We honor you by asking you to share your thoughts with us, and then we will honor you by subjecting you to the relentless dialectical process that will be embodied in 4 of our colleagues who will speak probably to some measure in praise of you, but probably to some measure using their own independent intelligence to intersect with these questions. These colleagues, as I think everyone knows, come to us, their studies involve really the whole world. Miriam Cook, whose work I know to involve Egypt and Syria and Lebanon and who knows what else. You are the only member of the Duke faculty with whom I have swum in the Persian Gulf. Wole Soyinka, who I'm so happy to have back here. You were here at the time of my inauguration, who we associate so richly with the literature of the world, but especially with Africa and Nigeria. Ranji Khanna, who again we could associate with many places in the world, but her most recent work known to me is associated with the Maghreb and Algeria. Ariel Dorfman, the only of my colleagues whose plays I've seen produced on Broadway, who comes to us from Latin America and everywhere else in the world. I thank you and the Franklin Center for creating this event, and I'm just happy, as we all are, to ask you to come forward, Fred, so that we can honor you before any Norwegian royalty get around to doing it.
Thanks, Dick, for that wonderful introduction. And I thank Srinivas for making a big deal out of this when it was supposed to be an informal get-together. What I'm going to do here is I should explain what these ceremonies in Norway involved. Actually, I wasn't supposed to speak at any of them, I don't think, which struck me as kind of odd, so I insisted on the right to say something. They have a long, all-day seminar on one of the days, and it actually is organized by 2 of our former students, of whom we're very proud, Sarah Danius and Tang Xiaobing, and include other students of ours, I believe. So I really said I have to say something at this. I mean, I don't see why I shouldn't, since they're supposed to be here in some connection with me. So they told me I could have 10 minutes. Well, you'll see. This is a little longer than that, but you will hear this. You will, in a sense, overhear this because I haven't changed anything. I'm going to read it to you as I will read it over there. And therefore, I'm terribly sorry for the people in the overflow rooms, but in a sense, this public who's present here is also just overhearing this as you are, and so maybe that's some consolation. Anyway, this is a talk on world literature. I actually thought of what seemed to me a more appropriate title, which is Whether World Literature has a Foreign Office or Not. You'll see what that means later on. So I'll simply read this, and then my colleagues who have seen it, I believe, will denounce it. This brief intervention, I'm speaking now to the Norwegian public. This brief intervention was suggested by my perplexity in the face of an interview question. There was a formal interview that they put on television that I made, really at the beginning of the fall. Excuse me. This brief intervention was suggested by my perplexity in the face of an interview question which asked me about the significance of international prizes such as this one of the Holberg International Memorial Prize. And I don't think I answered that very well, but I want now to say what I think that significance is. That is, now I will answer. But I will divide my answer into two parts. I'll answer the general question now and reserve a remark about the Holberg Prize in particular for tomorrow. And that's what you won't hear, although I can tell you what it will be, but that's much shorter. In a general way, today, the International Prize forces us to raise again the question of nations and the relationship of national literatures to each other. I will include the recipients of the Holberg under literature, following Goethe's idea that what he called world literature, and I sort of suppose with everyone else that he invented this term, was essentially a network or relationship of different national critics and thinkers among each other, above and beyond the translation of purely literary texts. And I think I'll come back to that later on. But does the nation-state still exist under globalization? And what can be the status of so-called world literature in that new global system? Would it be governed by something like a literary United Nations? So I want to say something about the nation today, and then about literary value, and finally about relationship as such, which according to me has to be grasped in terms of otherness and negativity. The national is preeminently the place of the dialectical union of opposites, the space where the opposites coincide. The national is thus, on the one hand, the space of the most abominable ethnic cleansing, of bigotry and xenophobia in their narrowest and most provincial forms. Everyone will think of their contemporary examples, to the point at which it seems almost obscene to undertake a celebration of nationalism in any form whatsoever today. Yet the national is also the figure for collectivity as such, whether we're talking about language, tribal or ethnic solidarity, or any other form of group or communal spirit. Indeed, class itself, social class, the one collective category which seems to achieve universality independently of any of those categories, has most often, in all modern revolutions without exception, also been expressed in nationalist terms. Or perhaps we might say that class solidarity in these revolutions has co-opted and appropriated the nationalist impulses. At any rate, it's worth affirming, as over against the various individualist ideologies, that the very form of the group and the collective is always worth celebrating, is always positive, and this certainly holds for the great nationalist movements, although perhaps we need to add Deleuze's proviso that the group or the national is always to be supported until it comes to power, until it achieves its nationalist ends, at which point it tends to swing back into its opposite, the tyranny of the majoritarian group, not so much over individuals as over the now minoritarian ones. I need to complete this picture of the dialectical ambivalence of the national with three observations, which I've developed further in other places. First, the nation still very much persists within globalization and is an essential component of it. And this for one simple reason, which is that it serves as the alibi for corporate oppression. The businessmen must be able to say, in order for England or Germany or the United States to remain competitive on the world market in globalization, workers must accept a cut in salary and a diminution of social benefits, the now infamous give back. The nation thus serves as the ironclad argument for the neoliberal dismantling of the welfare state. Second, we must not only understand the national in terms of jingoism and collective conceit, it is in fact far more the place of the national wound, the national misère, of the most intense forms of national inferiority complex, and thereby of ressentiment and humiliation. The smaller and more economically and globally marginal the country, the more intense is this unique taste of the national in its citizens' mouths, the more sour the limits of their collective identity feelings. This is what explains the formal necessity of what I call national allegory. Whatever the existential contents of the individual story or experience, it will always carry with it the overtone of this national subalternity. It will always be allegorical of the national misery. But as one approaches the center and the superstate, the more easy is it for its citizens to know the blindness of the center, to think of themselves in uniquely private terms, to forget the national relations, the foreign relations, which also define them, but which now, as we might put it, define them unconsciously and can be repressed and forgotten, a relief not possible in other parts of the world. There is then very much a national level to our existential experience, however apparent it may or may not be. But in my opinion, it's always a great mistake to try to theorize these matters and that level of things in the ideological terms of identity or culture. National identity, national culture. And as a third or final comment, I'll say that as a response to this vexed question of the terms nation, national, nationalism, and so forth, particularly in my use of them as synonyms for any kind of collectivity or group ethos, I will propose the more cumbersome but more precise formula of that national situation, an expression which very much includes these experiences of what I've called the national misery or national subalternity. Indeed, I think the notion of the national situation goes a long way towards rendering more coherent and more serviceable what Goethe called the concept of what Goethe called world literature. If you read his statements closely, you will see that they don't so much aim at characterizing the world fame of Lord Byron or the newly discovered universality of the Shakuntala or Persian poetry, so much as the emergence of what we may call institutions of cultural communication, the Revue des Deux Mondes, the Edinburgh Review, Le Globe, and so on and so forth, vehicles through which a foreigner can approach the national situation of a given country, including its literary and intellectual situation. What are the debates going on in this specific national situation? What are the concepts available to its intellectuals to articulate that situation? What literary forms respond to its needs or emerge as solutions to its dilemmas and contradictions? This is why I proposed elsewhere to replace the old two-term model of reader and text with a four-term one, especially in the context of international relations, but also in terms of history in the past. It is not a question of a reader of one country or period developing or inventing some immediate relationship to the text of another one. Goethe's reading of Lord Byron, say, or Pound's reading of the Provençal troubadours. It's rather a fourfold relationship in which the reader of one national situation achieves such contact with the text of another by way of the mediation of a relationship between two national situations. The national situation of provincial Germany in the 18th century, 19th century, enters into contact with the national situation of an emergent imperial Britain, and it's only by way of that relationship that the individual of the former country can hope for any ultimate contact with the texts which express the latter, by way, of course, of revolt and scandal. It's no longer here a question of a classic or of a universal literature. This is a complex contact between histories and concrete historical situations. And if this idea seems to perpetuate the old teleological conceptuality of more advanced or less developed, I think it does so only to undermine that teleology as well. For what must here finally emerge is the radical singularity and concrete difference of each of these situations. None is more advanced along some teleological pathway to modernity. Each is marked as uniquely determined and specific, which is to say, uniquely national. Now, one of the problems that misleads us here is the philosophical problem of aesthetic value, in my opinion, a false problem. It masks, indeed, a far more thorny philosophical problem, a real one this time, which turns on the opposition between universal and particular. For when humanist critics raise the question of value, what they really have in mind is universal value, and it's out of the notion of universal value that an antiquated and unserviceable notion of world literature has always come. I think this emphasis on universal value is wrong and misguided. It's unproductive even within the Western canon, giving rise to all kinds of false problems and questions like the following: is Faulkner greater than Haldor Laxness, or vice versa? Is either greater than Tolstoy? Which is more universal, I Promessi Sposi or Red Chamber Dream? I won't pursue these silly questions any further either, except to say that they follow historically the paradigm, the pattern of the famous Querelle des Anciens et des Modernes in the late 17th, early 18th century, insofar as that ended not with a decision about whether the ancients were greater than the moderns or vice versa, but simply in the discovery of history and difference that they were different. And that the question of value is itself a historical one, which arises only after the fact and does not involve classification according to a priori categories. Rather than a transcendental dimension in which works share the same henceforth universal values, I propose that we attempt to think of the enigmatic realm we call world literature as a space and site of struggle, of competition and opposition. The literary struggle can here first of all be grasped in terms of the struggle between big power languages and small power languages, and to be sure, in terms of the control of the institutions of translation and transmission, publishing companies, universities, and even still occasionally the cultural press, which regulate that struggle. But the question of big powers and small powers obviously brings us back squarely to the problem of the nation. I want here to propose a model of the dialectical unity of opposites and to insist on the way in which a text can be evaluated in positive and negative terms simultaneously. But I want first to pay homage to that book which I consider to have been the foundational work for a whole new comparative literature, assuming that we agree with Franco Moretti's observation that the question of world literature is the same as the question about comparative literature as such today. For Pascal Casanova's République mondiale des lettres, the World Republic of Letters, insists strongly on the antagonistic relationality between post-colonial and metropolitan literatures, and also on the mediatory role of a third player, namely Paris, as a kind of gold standard, if not universal bank, through which these antagonistic values are discounted and processed through a kind of currency exchange with each other. I regret I have no time to discuss this extraordinary and path-breaking work further here. I want to conclude by suggesting some of the problems that arise when we see world literature, not in terms of the value of a single great or classical work, but rather as a relationship between national productions, one that can be antagonistic or dissonant fully as much as it can be harmonious and somehow positive, that can involve difference fully as much as identity. So I would like us to imagine the following hypothetical possibilities. First, imagine a work of art which emerges from a generally nativist context, that is, ethnic, nationalist, and so on, which expresses the values of the national tradition and its uniqueness, its superiority over foreign and imported models, and which affirms the autonomy or the need for autonomy of the national culture and its rejection of imports, as well as its contempt for alien artworks and foreign ways of life. I won't give any examples. This is then a work of art which wishes to be absolutely particularist and to affirm its radical difference from those of other countries and its superiority over them. A work of this kind then wishes to be the opposite of universal, except insofar as this particular nativism might affirm itself as the only truly human form of life and culture. And if this nativism coincides with a national state form already achieved or longed and struggled for, then the work in question will generally be considered to fall under the rubric of nationalism and to raise all the problems associated with that ideology. But you're then also asked to imagine that this particular work, or body of work, has found worldwide acclamation and admiration. The international public then adds it to the pantheon of world literature and endows it with a nimbus of the world classic and of universality. This paradoxical result could be achieved in several different ways. The international public can, for example, choose to ignore the nationalistic and particularistic spirit and meaning of the work on the grounds that its political bias is irrelevant to its aesthetic qualities. Or it can simply misunderstand the work and fail to recognize its ideological and contextual significance for the home public. Or it can indeed argue that it is precisely its wrong-headed nationalistic passion, its situation-centeredness, its commitment to the concrete and to the blood and soil of the homeland, which makes for its force and its value as an example to the rest of the world. That would also be a misreading, since it substitutes for the unique national referent some alleged universal value of the national in general, the homeland in general, the unique native tradition in general. So we have here a most peculiar situation indeed. What is positive in one context is negative in the other. What wishes passionately to be particular on one level suddenly proves to be universal on another. What was rabidly ethnocentric is now saluted as part of the heritage of all mankind. To sharpen the paradox a little, we might have spoken of the deeper humanism of genocide, or the compassion of bigots and the progressive value of the most ignorant reactionaries. But now I want to reverse my first illustration and ask you to imagine a national literature in which, rather than singularity and the local or national, it is universality that's emphasized, perhaps in the name of classicism, or perhaps in that of some eternal humanism. A national aesthetic of this kind might well be projected in the name of some identification of the national character or vocation with human nature itself, or on the basis of an association of the national tradition with reason and clarity and the lack of specific national characteristics or idiosyncrasies. Yet we may also imagine that on the world stage, in a polyphony of distinct and colorful styles and artistic languages, this particular classicism that wants to be universal might well be found to be abstract and insipid without any great international appeal, and indeed, in a paradoxical reversal, simply taken as the local expression of some incomprehensible collective taste for an unadorned purity of little interest to the rest of the world. Here, universality itself becomes just another particularity, while implicitly it's particularity which comes to seem universal in some richly multicultural world bazaar. Indeed, we could make a case for modernism itself as staging just such a paradoxical situation in which it's the local and the singular which becomes universal, and which then discards the pretensions of some universal world aesthetics that set standard to the historical ash cans of boring and old-fashioned, and of the boring and the old-fashioned and outmoded. Modernism would then become a uniquely dialectical phenomenon in which it is precisely the commitment to the private, the local, or even the idiosyncrasies of a specific national culture, which is now alone capable of acceding to the abstractions, the necessarily abstract realm of the universal. That very singularity in language or in imagery or content, which is closed to us as foreigners, then becomes the seal and sign of the universal value of such art. While the attempt to contribute to world literature as such, to fashion a world which in its universal experience and its expression of the eternally human is dismissed as a humanism utterly without difference, without interest, and without the vocal power and resonance capable of carrying it across international borders. There's a suggestive political parallel here which I take to be structural in nature, if not in content. This is the disjunction between the realms of domestic and foreign policy, which are almost never homologous or isomorphic, but tend to stand in inverted ratios to each other. I think we're familiar in this country with a situation in which the domestic policy of a given administration could be judged progressive, while its foreign policy is quite the reverse and can be characterized as repressive. But the opposite is also true, and we've been able historically to observe a reactionary regime with a progressive foreign policy. I think, and my other example was actually North Carolina, which until the last election, you could vote the straight Democratic ticket as your domestic politics and then vote for the Republican president in a separate button. I think this is because in personal identity as well as in the external world, these two dimensions, the subjective or existential one and the objective relationship with the other, collective relations as opposed to individual ones, today miss each other like different planes in infinite space, although one can imagine worlds or historical moments in which this would not be the case. So also, I think, with the foreign policy of literature, so to speak, as opposed to its domestic one. The only way of thinking these two incommensurable realities together without collapsing one into the other is the dialectic, one of whose functions is precisely to conceptualize what is thus contradictory or non-thinkable. Works thus function simultaneously on both of these levels, as it were, on the foreign policy level and the domestic level. A work thus emits two messages simultaneously. It is at one and the same time about itself and about the world, an autoreferential designation and a new construction of language, the psyche, the situation as such. And in that Darwinian process, which as Franco Moretti has shown us is as fruitful a figurative reference for all this as the market, the work must wage a dual struggle. As a formal mutation, it must attempt to survive in its own internal cultural habitat or ecosystem, and also affirm itself outside on the world scale against its competitors for other countries who are as hungry for recognition and species perpetuation as it is itself. But as we've shown, these two simultaneous struggles may involve quite different and sometimes incompatible strategies. Well, the Althusserians used to talk not about proposing solutions, but about producing problems. I don't feel I've done much more than that today. On the other hand, they also thought that to produce a problem was better than any of the solutions one might concoct for it. And I'm reassured by that belief. Yet if I haven't solved anything here, these considerations have at least put me in a better position to try to answer the original question I found myself confronted with, namely the significance of international prizes. And so I conclude in this way. The older system of prizes sought to establish universal values. A literary canon, for example, valid for the whole world, in such a way that the classics of the smaller language countries, or the non-Western ones, were afforded their rightful place among the more generally acknowledged big power Western masterpieces. Now, however, today, what any concept of world literature must include is the operation not only of radical difference and of opposition, but also of dialectical ambivalence as well as unevenness and canonical inequality, if I may put it that way. Therefore, the emergence of such awards from non-central countries, non-hegemonic locations, from Stockholm or Bergen, for example, rather than from Paris, London, or New York, has the effect of suddenly lighting up the international grid, of unexpectedly mapping literary globalization for us, of confronting us not with some universalizing solution, but rather with an ongoing problem, the problematic of the nature of global relationships and their structure and dynamics today. World literature is then not some already given pantheon or imaginary museum to which masterpieces are regularly added. It is another name for a problem and a conundrum. How can differences relate today? How can nationality be universal? How can global multiplicity be imagined without a center?
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.